The courtroom was silent, almost unnervingly so. Then came the soft creak of the heavy wooden doors, as 5-year-old Emily Carter stepped inside. Her tiny hand clutched tightly around the leash of a German shepherd named Rex, a dog whose body bore the marks of a darker past, including a long, jagged scar running down his side. Every eye in the room followed her, as she walked slowly toward the witness stand. Hesitant, yet steady. Determined. Judge Mark Sullivan leaned forward from the bench. A seasoned man with decades of legal experience. But at that moment, even he was not sure what to expect. Because everything, the entire case, now rested on the fragile shoulders of this little girl. Emily was the only witness to a brutal attempted abduction. A case that could put a dangerous man behind bars for life. But there was one problem. Emily had not spoken. Not a single word. Since the night it happened. Across the courtroom, Richard Hale sat calmly at the defense table. Unassuming, composed, even smug. A 45-year-old software engineer who, on the surface, seemed completely harmless. But he had been arrested after being placed at the scene, by one witness. Emily. Still, there was no physical evidence. No confession. And a witness who could not speak. His lawyer had crafted a clean strategy. Discredit the girl. Claim trauma had blurred her memory. And convince the jury that this case was nothing more than a tragic misunderstanding. But then, something unexpected happened. As Emily settled into the witness chair, her green eyes met Richard Hale's across the courtroom. And at that moment, her small fingers moved, just slightly. A subtle motion, so soft it could have gone unnoticed. But two beings in that room caught it. One was Judge Sullivan, and the other was Rex. The moment Emily gave that silent signal, something she had been taught during weeks of therapy, Rex's body went completely still. His ears pricked forward. His muscles coiled like a loaded spring. And from deep within his chest came a low, guttural growl. It was not fear. It was not stressful. It was recognition. His eyes, golden brown and locked like a laser, stared directly at Richard Hale. Unblinking. Unmoving. A chill ran through the courtroom. Spectators shifted in their seats. A murmur swept through the gallery. Whispers began to rise. This was not just a support animal reacting to his handler's distress. This was something different. Something primal. Then, crack. The gavel came down. This court will take a 15-minute recess, Judge Sullivan declared, his voice sharper than usual. Prosecutor Jenna Collins gave him a puzzled look, but he did not meet her gaze. His eyes remained on Emily. And on Rex, the dog now pressed tightly against her side like a living shield. Something had just happened. And before this trial moved forward, Judge Sullivan knew. He had to understand exactly what it was. What exactly had Rex recognized? And more importantly, what did it mean for the case? Out in the hallway, Emily knelt beside Rex, her tiny hands gripping tightly onto his fur, refusing to let go. Her mother, Sarah Carter, bent down beside her, smoothing back the child's curly hair with trembling fingers. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered. Emily did not answer. She did not need to. Her grip on Rex only tightened. Her small frame pressed closely against his side. Just a few steps away, Jack Monroe stood quietly watching. A seasoned FBI investigator with decades of field experience. He had seen a lot in his lifetime. But something about what had just unfolded in that courtroom. had shifted his instincts into high alert. That dog was not reacting out of stress. Not out of confusion. Something spooked him. He stepped closer to Judge Sullivan. His voice was low, barely audible. "Something spooked that dog," he murmured. "I would bet my badge he recognizes Hale from somewhere." Judge Sullivan exhaled slowly. His sharp blue eyes narrowed with focus. "Then we need to find out where," he replied. Meanwhile, inside the defense's private room, Richard Hale sat across from his attorney, Michael Graves. The moment they were alone, the smugness on Hale's face shifted, twisting into something colder, sharper. He tapped his fingers against the table, replay after replay running through his mind. The girl had not spoken. But the dog had reacted. "She knows," he muttered under his breath. Graves raised an eyebrow. "What was that?" he asked. Hale looked up with a forced smile. "Nothing," he said quietly. But inside his head, the panic had begun. That dog. That damn dog. He had not considered the animal might be a problem. But now, he realized, Rex might be the one thread that could unravel everything. As the 15-minute recess came to an end, Judge Sullivan adjusted his robes and took a deep breath. He had never been a man who believed in coincidences. And something in his gut told him Rex had just given them the most important clue of this entire trial. It was time to dig deeper. And for the first time since this case began, he felt the tide shifting. But before the silence, before the courtroom, before the trauma that stole her voice, Emily Carter had been a bright, joyful child. At 5 years old, she was a walking bundle of energy, a chatterbox filled with wonder and imagination. The kind of little girl who could fill a room with stories, one after another. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with curiosity and mischief. She loved fairy tales. She loved stuffed animals. And she especially loved the way her mother read bedtime stories, changing her voice for every character. Emily had never known fear. Until that afternoon. It had started as a perfect spring day, the kind where flowers filled the breeze with their fragrance, and warm sunlight spilled golden streaks across the backyard. Sarah Carter had been in the kitchen, watching her daughter twirl in the yard, a soft smile on her face. Emily wore a pink dress that danced in the wind, spinning like a little ballerina. And at that moment, nothing, not even the faintest shadow, hinted at what was coming. Carter was due home in just a few hours. And Sarah had been debating whether to start dinner, or wait for him. It should have been an ordinary afternoon. It should have been safe. At 3:42 p.m., Sarah's phone rang. It was her sister, calling from out of state. So Sarah stepped inside for what she thought would be a quick conversation. 4 minutes. That was all it took. When she returned to the yard, the gate stood ajar. A sudden wave of cold terror surged through her body. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the space where her daughter had just been moments ago. Emily was still there. But she was not alone. A black van idled near the curb. Its side door is slightly open. And beside Emily knelt a man. His smile was warm. But not the good kind. It was practiced. Too smooth. Too perfect. "I have puppies in my van," he said. His voice was calm, rehearsed. "Special ones, they need a little girl to take care of them. Would you like to see?" Sarah's world seemed to freeze. Her instincts kicked in. faster than her thoughts could even catch up. "Emily!" Her voice tore through the quiet like a siren. The man's head snapped up. His smile vanished, replaced instantly with something sharp and cold. In that same second, he grabbed Emily's arm. Emily froze. She did not scream. She did not fight. She only stared at him, wide-eyed, unblinking, as if some deep-rooted terror had locked her in place. Across the street, Martha Jenkins, a retired nurse walking her small terrier, saw it all unfold. Her voice, weathered with age, but firm with conviction, rang out across the street. "Hey! Get away from that child!" The man hesitated. His grip loosened, for just a fraction of a second. And that was all it took. Emily yanked her arm free and bolted toward her mother. Sarah scooped her up, holding her tight. Just as the van's engine roared to life, tires screamed, rubber burned against the pavement, and the vehicle sped off, leaving thick black streaks on the road. Sarah clutched Emily against her chest, her heart pounding in her ribs like a war drum. But Emily did not cry. She did not say a word. She only buried her face into her mother's shoulder and trembled. The police arrived within minutes. Detective Jack Monroe, a seasoned agent from the FBI's Child Abduction Task Force, took immediate control of the scene. His graying hair and sharp brown eyes told the story of a man who had spent years chasing shadows, hunting those who preyed on the innocent. He had seen this pattern before. Too many times. "He fits the profile," Monroe muttered, flipping through a weather notebook. 4 children have vanished in the last 18 months. All approached near their homes. All lured by promises of puppies. His partner, Agent Lisa Grant, knelt gently beside Emily. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Sweetheart, do you remember what the man looked like?" Silence. Sarah gently brushed her daughter's hair back, her own hands trembling. "Honey, it is okay, you are safe now. Can you tell the nice officer what he looked like?" Emily's small hands. Emily gripped her mother's sweater tightly. But she did not speak. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and shut her voice off completely. "She has not said a word since I picked her up," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "She just will not talk." Agent Grant exchanged a knowing glance with Monroe. "Selective mutism," she murmured. "A trauma response." Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. "Without a statement, we do not have much. The description is vague. A man, a black van. It could be anyone." Just then, Martha Jenkins, the retired nurse who had witnessed the attempted abduction, stepped forward. "I got part of the license plate," she said firmly. "The first 3 letters. YKZ. Monroe's gaze snapped to her. "That is something," he said. Finally, a lead. Sarah, still holding Emily close, felt a deep wave of helplessness wash over her. Her daughter, once so full of life, had withdrawn completely. And in the days that followed, it only got worse. Emily stopped playing. She stopped drawing. She refused to leave the house. She flinched at the sight of passing cars. She barely slept. And when she did, her nights were filled with silent nightmares. Her small body would thrash against unseen horrors. Her lips parted in terror. But no screams ever came. Only gasps. Soft and broken. gasps that woke her parents in the dead of night. Sarah and David tried everything. Story time. Her favorite foods. Her beloved stuffed bunny. Nothing worked. The child they knew was slipping further and further away. One evening, Sarah sat across from David at the kitchen table, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. "The therapist recommended a support animal," she said quietly. "A therapy dog." David ran a tired hand through his hair. "You really think that will help?" "I do not know," Sarah admitted. "But I am willing to try anything." Either of them could have known how much that one decision would change everything. Because while Emily had lost her voice, there was someone who could still hear her. And his name was Rex. The air inside Dr. Laura Bennett's Animal Rehabilitation Center was heavy. A mix of antiseptic and the earthy musk of fur. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional scratch of claws against the tiled floor. On a large orthopedic bed near the window, a German shepherd lay still. His deep brown eyes followed every movement, watching with quiet intensity. His name was Rex. Once, he had been one of the city's finest canine officers. A dog whose instincts and training had saved lives. But now, he bore the scars of sacrifice. One particularly jagged mark ran along his right flank, a permanent reminder of the night that ended his career. 3 years ago, during a raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Rex had lunged at an armed suspect. Without hesitation, the man had slashed at him. The blade meant for a fellow officer. The blade had cut deep into Rex's flesh. But even as blood darkened his fur, Rex did not stop. He subdued the suspect, pinned him down, and saved the officer's life. But in the months that followed, the injury never truly healed. His mobility was impaired, his gait uneven, and the department, already strapped for funding, made a difficult decision. They retired him. And worse, they placed him on a euthanasia list, deemed unfit for further service. But that was before Laura stepped in. Dr. Laura Bennett had spent years building her therapy animal program, specializing in cases where animals could help trauma survivors. When she heard about Rex's case, she refused to let him go. She fought to adopt him, convinced that his sharp mind and unwavering loyalty still had value. And now, she was about to test that belief. Sarah Carter sat nervously in a chair, her fingers gripped tightly around the fabric of her skirt. Just behind her, Emily peeked out from behind her mother's shoulder. The little girl had not spoken a single word. Since the incident, 2 weeks ago, she had attended therapy. She had met with specialists. But nothing had coaxed a word from her. Laura knelt to Emily's level. Her voice is soft, gentle, steady. "Hi, Emily. My name is Laura. I work with very special dogs. Dogs that help kids who have been through scary things." Emily said nothing. Her green eyes flickered to the large German shepherd sitting a few feet away. Rex sat quietly, his ears perked forward. But he did not move toward her. He simply watched. His presence is calm, patient, unthreatening. "Would you like to meet him?" Laura asked softly. Emily did not answer. But she did not run either. And that was a start. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair gently. "He is a very nice dog, sweetheart. He used to be a police dog, just like the ones in your storybooks. Laura glanced at Rex and gave a quiet command. Stay. The German shepherd did not move. Not even a twitch. Then Laura turned back to Emily. You do not have to come close if you do not want to. Rex will wait right here. But if you feel ready, you can put out your hand, and he will come to you. Emily stood frozen for a long moment. Silent, unmoving. Then, inch by inch, she stepped out from behind her mother. Her tiny hand lifted. Trembling, but deliberately, Rex remained still, waiting for the final cue. Laura nodded, and slowly, Rex lowered his head. He took a step forward, then another, and another, until his warm breath touched Emily's palm. And in that instant, something shifted. Emily's small fingers curled slightly, brushing through the dog's thick fur. The connection was made. Sarah gasped softly. Her hand was flying to her mouth. It was the first time Emily had reached out to anything, or anyone, since the attack. Tears welled in her eyes. Oh, baby, she whispered. Emily's fingers dug deeper into Rex's coat, gripping him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had become terrifyingly uncertain. Laura smiled. That is a good girl, Emily. Rex likes you. The child said nothing, but she did not let go. In the days that followed, Rex and Emily became inseparable. At home, she would sit. Emily would sit beside him for hours, her tiny hands gently tracing the scar that ran along his side. When the nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, it was Rex's steady heartbeat, not words, that calmed her. Though she still refused to speak, she began to draw again. Simple crayon pictures. A girl and a dog, standing together, facing down shadowy figures. One afternoon, while sitting on the floor of Laura's office, Emily was watching Rex perform a simple trick. And then, something remarkable happened. Good boy, she whispered. The words were so soft, so fragile, that for a moment, Sarah thought she had imagined them. But when she turned, she saw Emily staring at Rex. Her lips parted slightly in wonder, as if even she had surprised herself. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. It was not much, but it was a beginning. Laura placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. She trusts him, she murmured. Sometimes trust is the first step toward finding your voice again. Sarah squeezed her hand gently. Then we will follow wherever that trust leads. And it would lead them somewhere they never expected. To a courtroom, where a monster would finally be unmasked. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The seats in the gallery were filled. Journalists, families, legal observers, all watching with anticipation, as one of the most high-profile trials in recent memory was about to begin. In the center of the room, the defendant, Richard Hale, sat beside his attorney, his expression unreadable, despite the weight of the charges against him. He appeared disturbingly calm. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wood of the defense table. Seated beside her mother, Emily Carter clutched the leash tightly. Her small fingers wrapped around the thick fabric, as if it were a lifeline. Rex sat beside her, alert, composed, his ears pricked forward, his deep brown eyes locked onto Hale. Every so often, his nose would twitch, as if sensing something familiar in the air. All rise. The bailiff's voice rang through the chamber. Judge Mark Sullivan entered, his robe flowing behind him. His steps measured, deliberate. He took his seat at the elevated bench. His sharp eyes scanned the room, before settling briefly on Emily and Rex. He had already made a ruling, allowing the therapy dog to be present. But he knew that decision was far from universally accepted. Before we proceed with opening statements, Judge Sullivan said, his voice deep and steady, the court will hear arguments regarding the presence of the support animal in these proceedings. Michael Graves, the defense attorney, rose smoothly from his seat, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. Your Honor, he began. His tone is polite, but firm. While we understand the prosecution's argument for emotional support, the presence of this animal is highly prejudicial. A large German Shepherd in the courtroom may evoke an emotional response from the jury that could and would unfairly bias them against my client. We request that the dog be removed during testimony. The prosecutor stood immediately in response. Your Honor, Emily Carter is 5 years old and a trauma survivor. She has been diagnosed with selective mutism as a direct result of her experience. Rex is not here as a spectacle. He is here as a medically necessary support animal. His presence allows Emily to participate in these proceedings without undue distress. Judge Sullivan leaned back in his chair. His expression is unreadable. I have already reviewed the documentation submitted by the child psychologist and the animal behaviorist. The dog remains. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some in agreement, others grumbling under their breath. Graves pressed his lips together, clearly displeased, but unwilling to argue further. He returned to his seat, shooting a glance at Hale, who remained eerily expressionless. The trial began in earnest. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of Hale's actions. A pattern of manipulation, deception, and predatory behavior, spanning years. Witnesses were called, including the elderly neighbor, Martha Jenkins, who recounted the terrifying moment she saw Hale trying to lure Emily into his van. Her voice trembled as she described the way he had grabbed the child's arm before fleeing when confronted. Emily sat silently through it all, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden chair. Her fingers occasionally flexed around the leash, but she never let go. Whenever the tension became too much, she would glance down at Rex, who remained perfectly still, his quiet presence grounding her. Then, it was time for her testimony. A hush fell over the courtroom. Emily was gently led to the witness stand. Sarah Carter walked beside her. Her protective gaze never leaves her daughter. She helped Emily into the seat before stepping away, though every muscle in her body was taut, with the urge to scoop her daughter into her arms and carry her far from this place. Jenna Collins approached carefully. Her demeanor is soft and warm. Hi, Emily, she said with a gentle smile. I know this is a little scary, but remember, you do not have to say anything you do not want to. You can just nod or shake your head if that feels more comfortable. And if you ever need a break, you can let us know. Emily did not look at her. Her gaze stayed fixed on the table, her breathing shallow. But then, as if sensing her unease, Rex pressed his body lightly against her leg. Emily reached down and gripped a handful of his fur. Slowly, she nodded. Good, Jenna said softly, keeping her voice light. Emily, can you tell us who was with you in your yard that day? Emily hesitated. She did not lift her head. But after a long moment, she slowly raised her arm and pointed directly at Richard Hale. The defendant's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. A brief, involuntary tightening of his jaw. Graves immediately stood. Objection! Graves' voice rang out, sharp and immediate. The child has been repeatedly shown images of my client prior to trial. This identification is unreliable. Judge Sullivan held up a hand. Overruled. The jury will determine the credibility of the witness. Jenna continued, her tone is steady. Emily, did this man say anything to you that day? The child did not speak. Instead, she made a small movement with her hand. A subtle sign. It was the same signal she had given before. The one that Rex understood. The German Shepherd responded instantly. His ears snapped forward. His muscles tensed. And a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. It was not aggressive. It was a warning. The reaction sent a shock wave through the courtroom. Even Judge Sullivan sat forward. His brow furrowed, eyes locked on the dog. Graves stood again, this time more urgently. Your Honor! I object. This is theatrical. But Sullivan was not listening. He was watching Rex. The dog had gone utterly still. His entire focus locked onto Hale. As if recognizing a scent only he could perceive. It was the exact same reaction he had when Emily first saw Hale. The same, instinctual response. A thought struck Sullivan. He turned to Jenna. Miss Collins, he said, his voice carefully measured. Has this animal had any prior interaction with the defendant? Jenna hesitated. Not to my knowledge, Your Honor. Sullivan turned to the defense table. Mr. Hale, have you encountered this dog before? For the first time. Hale showed real emotion. His fingers, which had been tapping so calmly earlier, now clenched into a fist. He remained silent. Then, Jenna's eyes widened. A realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She turned to her co-counsel and whispered something quickly. Seconds later, a member of the prosecution team rushed out of the courtroom. What is going on? Graves demanded. His patience wears thin. Jenna straightened. Her expression is unreadable. Your Honor, I request a short recess. There may be new evidence relevant to this case. Judge Sullivan studied her. Silent for a long moment. Then nodded. 15-minute recess. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. Speculation spread like wildfire. Had Rex just recognized Richard Hale? And if so, from where? Something told Judge Sullivan that the answer to that question would change everything. The weight of the case bore down on the prosecution team. New developments were surfacing fast. Richard Hale had been officially linked to multiple disappearances. Yet without Emily's full testimony, the trial still teetered on the edge of uncertainty. What no one expected, however, was that the key to unraveling the case would not come from the child, but from the German Shepherd, who never left her side. The morning was crisp. As the prosecution team, led by Jenna Collins, presented their next motion to introduce new forensic evidence, the soil samples found in Richard Hale's van had been analyzed, and the results pointed to a very specific location: a remote, unoccupied cabin in the northern woods. Detective Jack Monroe, having worked on similar cases for decades, knew exactly what this could mean. Your Honor, Collins addressed. Judge Sullivan, we request a 24-hour recess to follow up on a crucial lead. We believe this evidence may provide the final piece needed to close this case. Michael Graves, Hale's defense attorney, was quick to object. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a delay tactic. My client has already been through extensive questioning, and there is no solid evidence tying him to this so-called cabin. Soil samples are circumstantial at best. Judge Sullivan's stern gaze silenced him. Motion granted, he ruled. The prosecution has 24 hours. Court adjourned. As soon as the judge's gavel struck, Detective Monroe and his team mobilized. And Rex, Emily's ever-watchful protector, was brought along for the operation. His reaction to Hale had been unmistakable. Perhaps he could sense something human eyes had missed. The search team arrived at the desolate cabin by early afternoon. The place was eerily silent. The surrounding trees whispered in the wind. A thick layer of dust coated the porch. Yet faint footprints, leading toward the back door, suggested recent activity. Rex was the first to react. As soon as they approached the cabin, his ears perked, his nose twitched with intense focus. His body stiffened, tail raised, muscles taut like a coiled spring. He let out a low growl, pacing anxiously at the threshold. This place is wrong, Monroe murmured. Rex knows something is here. The team proceeded cautiously, weapons drawn. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A table, a cot, empty food cans stacked in a corner. But then, Monroe noticed something odd. A section of wooden floor near the back wall had an unnatural seam. A faint indentation that did not belong. He knocked on it. Hollow. There is something under here, he said. With swift precision, the officers pried the boards loose. What lay beneath sent a chill down every spine. A narrow staircase spiraled into a hidden basement. The air turned cold and damp as they descended. Dim light revealed the horrific sight. Children's belongings. Old toys, small shoes. A faded pink backpack. And in the farthest corner, chained, but still alive, was a girl. Emma Sullivan. 8 years old. Missing for 6 months. Her face was pale, her clothes ragged.